You're standing beside a mound of stored grain, thousands and thousands of years before anyone invents the word pet. Something moves right at the edge of your vision. A small, sharp-eyed animal, slipping along the wall, low and unhurried, eyes locked on the same rats that have been getting into your food for months. Nobody invited it in. Nobody trained it. It just showed up one day, and it never really left. So if nobody ever set out to tame a cat, how did one of the most solitary, self-sufficient predators on the planet end up asleep on your bed tonight, purring quietly, without a leash in sight? Every other animal sharing your house has a domestication story that starts with a human making a decision. Someone chose the calmest wolves to breed generation after generation, over thousands of years, deliberately shaping them until they became dogs. Someone selected which cattle to keep penned, which sheep to shear, which horses were calm enough to ride. Every step involved a person picking winners. That's not what happened with cats, not for a very long stretch of shared history. Nobody bred them on purpose for thousands upon thousands of years. They walked into human life almost entirely on their own terms, which is why scientists usually describe what happened to cats as self-domestication instead of domestication. The proof for how early this started was sitting in the ground on the island of Cyprus. In 2004, archaeologists working a Neolithic site called Chilarokambos found a grave roughly 9,500 years old. Inside it lay a human, around 30 years old, buried with seashells and polished stone tools, rich enough to suggest real social standing. Less than half a meter away, at the same depth, in the same soil, lay a cat, about 8 months old, clearly placed there on purpose rather than simply left where it died. Cyprus has no native wildcats, none at all. Every land mammal on that island had to arrive by boat, which means someone loaded a live, presumably unhappy wildcat onto a small wooden vessel and carried it across open water on purpose, alongside people, tools, and supplies that actually mattered for survival. You don't waste precious cargo space on an animal you have no relationship with. This grave predates the earliest Egyptian art showing cats by more than 4,000 years, and for a long time, Egypt got all the credit for a relationship that had actually started somewhere else entirely. Archaeologists are careful with their wording here, because the terms actually mean different things. Real domestication, in the strict sense, usually shows up in the bones themselves over generations. Animals shrink, skulls shorten, teeth crowd differently, brains even get slightly smaller. This particular Cyprus cat showed none of that. Its skeleton still looked completely wild, identical in every measurable way to a hunting cat living free in the hills nearby. Researchers call this earlier stage taming, rather than full domestication, a meaningful, deliberate relationship that simply hadn't yet reshaped the animal's body. And it's worth noting that deliberate dog burials go back even further, to roughly 12,000 years ago. Cats were still catching up. So what actually happened, and why the Fertile Crescent region specifically, out of everywhere wildcats lived? Around 10,000 years ago, humans in that region started doing something no one had done at scale before, storing huge amounts of surplus wheat and barley in one place. Grain attracts rodents, especially house mice. Rodents attract predators, and waiting in the grasslands nearby was the African wildcat, a small, solitary hunter perfectly built for exactly this kind of easy, reliable meal. Most wildcats would have kept their distance, the way wild animals usually do around unfamiliar activity. But individual animals vary, and some wildcats are simply calmer than others around noise, movement, and strangers. Those slightly bolder, slightly more tolerant cats could feed at the edges of a human settlement without bolting every time someone walked past. That tolerance meant more food, more surviving litters, and more kittens carrying the same laid-back temperament. Humans never selected for it directly, not with any intention. The rodents and the grain did the selecting, generation after generation, until the wildcats hanging around villages were measurably calmer than the ones still living entirely on their own out in the wild. Genetic studies of modern cats trace nearly all of them back to this single Near Eastern wildcat population, right around the same era agriculture itself was taking off. That's the version of the story most people have heard. It's not the only one, and self-domestication of this kind is genuinely rare in the animal kingdom. Rare enough that scientists are still arguing over exactly how many other species have managed to pull it off at all, or whether cats are close to a category of one. In 2001, archaeologists digging at a farming village called Chuanhuchun in central China pulled cat bones out of an ancient garbage pit, mixed in with pottery fragments and stone tools. Carbon and nitrogen analysis of those bones told a very specific story. These animals had been eating rodents that had themselves been eating farmed millet. One of the cats was old, with heavily worn teeth suggesting a long life rather than a short wild one, and had been eating more grain-based food than a wild hunter normally would, which strongly suggests someone had been feeding it scraps for years. The same quiet arrangement playing out an ocean away from where it first began. Same setup, roughly. Same mutual arrangement between farmer and predator. Same rough idea, just a few thousand years later, and thousands of miles away from where it first started. For a while, researchers wondered if this was simply a second, geographically separate population of the exact same wildcat species, finding its own way into China. Then someone actually identified which species these bones belonged to, and the story got a lot stranger. They weren't the same wildcat from the Fertile Crescent at all. They were leopard cats, a completely different, spotted wild species native to Asia that has no meaningful genetic relationship whatsoever to modern house cats. China had its own version of this exact process running quietly in parallel for well over 3,000 years, an entire separate domestication experiment playing out at farming villages across the region, and it left almost no trace in your actual cat's family tree today. It was a dead end. Sometime around 1,300 years ago, real domestic cats, descendants of that original Near Eastern lineage, finally arrived in China along Silk Road trade routes. They spread through farms and villages, and the leopard cats that had been doing the exact same job for 3,000 years quietly got replaced, without ever leaving so much as a myth or a written record behind them. An entire independent domestication experiment, run by a completely different species, effectively erased from memory until isotope chemistry accidentally dug it back up. Only one lineage actually won, and once it did, it spread fast. Cats caught rides on ships to control rodents that would otherwise chew through rope, grain sacks, and cargo holds, hitching a ride to nearly every port on Earth along established trade routes, often becoming the single most valuable crew member nobody ever had to formally hire, pay, or feed. Egypt didn't invent the relationship, but it did formalize it centuries later, and it did so dramatically. Cats there became sacred animals tied to the goddess Bastet, protected by law strict enough that killing one, even by accident, could carry the death penalty. Households reportedly mourned a cat's death by shaving their eyebrows. Millions were mummified and buried in dedicated cat cemeteries, wrapped in linen with the same care given to human dead. Egyptian wildcats even folded their own genetics back into the mix at this later stage, adding to a bloodline that was already spreading across 3 continents. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you a little, if you've ever assumed your cat is basically a small, furry appliance. Compared to dogs, which have been reshaped by thousands of years of deliberate breeding into everything from wolfhounds to teacup poodles, house cats have barely changed at all. Genetically, a modern house cat is remarkably close to the wildcat that first wandered toward that ancient grain pile. Drop most house cats in the wild tomorrow, and a significant number of them would manage just fine, hunting and surviving without missing a beat. Feral cat populations interbreed easily with wild cats in the areas where both still exist, blurring a line that, in most domesticated species, closed permanently a long time ago. Humans never fully rewired this animal the way we rewired wolves or cattle or horses. We just made the deal comfortable enough that it kept renewing itself, one generation at a time, without anyone ever formally agreeing to anything. So the cat curled up in your home tonight isn't there because anyone tamed it into submission thousands of years ago. It's there because a wild, deeply capable predator looked at what humans were quietly offering, generation after generation, on an entirely different continent from where the whole arrangement started, and decided the deal was still worth keeping. Every single one of its ancestors made that same choice, over and over, for about 400 generations, and never once had to. No leash forced it, no fence held it, no breeder decided which kittens got to survive and which didn't. Nobody domesticated the cat, not really. It's been auditioning the relationship for 10,000 years, testing it fresh in every single litter, and it could still walk away any time it wanted to. Most of them just don't.